Hey guys, so today we're going to go over other methods of factoring. So the first thing we're going to talk about is factor by grouping. And there's two different ways we can use this. You're going to use this when you have trinomials. Technically, you can use it anytime you have trinomials, but we're specifically going to be looking for when a does not equal 1. You could also use this when there are 4 terms. But again, we're specifically going to be looking for trinomials where a does not equal 1. So let's get into it. So number 1, let's do 6x squared plus 19x plus 10. 6x squared plus 19x plus 10. So our first step, if we're using the grouping method, is to multiply our a term and our c term. So that means I'm going to multiply 6 times 10. So 6 times 10 is 60. My second step is I'm going to factor sum with this. So I'm going to find factors of 60 that have a sum of 19. So two numbers that multiply to 60 that add to 19. Now, often I find this is probably where people struggle the most, is that they can't think of the factors. So what you could always do is list off your factors of 60 and see which ones have a sum of 19. So you always start with 1 and 60, and then we go down our list. So after 1 goes 2. Well, 2 goes into 60 30 times. Then I go to 3. 3 goes into 60 20 times. Then I go into 4. 4 goes into 60 15 times. 5 goes into 60 12 times. 6 goes in 10. 7 does not go into 60, so I don't list it. Neither does 8 or 9, so I don't list it. And then I'm back at 10. So now here are all of the possible combinations that I could have. Which ones have a sum of 19? Would be 4 and 15. So the next thing we're going to do is split our b term. I'm going to split our b term, and I'm going to split this into a 4x plus a 15x. I can bring down the other two, so I still have a 6x squared, and I still have a plus 10. So then I'm going to group them. So I'm going to draw parentheses around the first two and parentheses around the second two. And then I'm going to factor out a GCF from each group. So from my first term, my greatest common factor would be a 2x. And after I factor out a greatest common factor, I'm left with 3x plus 2. My greatest common factor between a positive 15x and a positive 10x would be a positive 5. And I'm left with a 3x plus 2. Notice what is inside our parentheses is the same. We're factoring out a 3x plus 2 now. This is the first part of our answer. Our second part is the numbers on the outside. So the 2x plus 5. So this is how we're going to factor trinomials that do not equal 1. In my class, I use a method called SAM for factoring, but I'm pretty sure this is what your teacher taught you. So I just want to kind of keep it consistent for you. So let's try another. Let's do 2x squared minus 7x minus 4. So our first step in factoring is to multiply 2 times negative 4. So we're going to find factors of negative 8 that have a sum of negative 7. So two numbers that'll multiply to a negative 8 and add to a negative 7. So let's list off, if you don't know, our factors of 8. So 1 and 8. And then we go to 2. So 2 goes in there 4 times. 3 does not go in there, and now I'm back at 4. So these are the only pairs of numbers I'm looking at. Since one of them has to be negative, I need to make either one of these negative so that they add to a negative 7. So this would be making negative 8 and leaving the 1 positive. So this would be my pair. So I'm going to split this. Now it doesn't matter if we split it into a positive 1 or negative 8 or a negative 8 and positive 1. It's generally easier if you put the negative 1 first. So if I make this a negative 8x and a positive 1x, but it would work either way. Now the difference here is that if you put the negative here, when you factor out a greatest common factor, you're going to factor out a negative, which is fine, it still works. So my second step is to group them. So I'll draw parentheses around the first two, parentheses around the second two. My greatest common factor from my first parenthesis is a 2x. And when I factor out a 2x, I'm left with an x minus 4. Now when I look at my greatest common factor from my second parenthesis, the biggest number that goes into both 1x and 4 is 1. And since the 1x here is positive, I'm going to factor out a positive 1. You're basically going to take the sign of whatever this first one is. If it's positive, you're going to factor out a positive. If it's negative, you're going to factor out a negative. So I factor out a positive 1. And when I divide each term by positive 1, I'm left with x minus 4. So what's inside the parentheses is one of my answers. And the GCF on the outside is my other. And again, it doesn't matter the order of the parenthesis that is written. You could also have 2x plus 1 and x minus 4. This would be okay as well. This is determined by your the order that you split it. So if I had split it into a positive 1 and negative 8, I would have probably ended up with this version. So that's why the order doesn't matter. Number 3, 6x squared plus 5x minus 6. So what I'd like you to do is pause the video for you to try this one. Go ahead and pause the video and see if you guys can get this one. All right, so here we go. You should have multiplied 6 times negative 6 to get factors of negative 36. that have a sum of 5. So then you figure out your multiples. If you already know this off the top of your head, you don't have to list them off, but it's always, if you struggle with this, it's a good way to help. 1 in 36. 2 goes into 36 18 times. 3 goes in 12 times. 4 goes in 9 times. 5 does not go in. 6 goes in 6 times, and now I've started wrapping back around. Now, since it's a negative 36, I need to make one of the pairs negative. So for this to work, I would make the 4 negative, so that negative 4 and positive 9 give us our answer. So now when we split these, it's easier if the negative one comes first. So negative 4x plus 9x. And I'll do an example where the negative one does not come first. So then we group them. Your greatest common factor, the biggest number that goes into both 6x squared minus 4x, is a 2x. And that leaves me with a 3x minus 4. Excuse me, a 3x minus 2. My greatest common factor between a positive 9x and a negative 6 would be a positive 3, which would leave me with a 3x minus 2. Now, if we did not get the same thing in this parentheses, that means we did something wrong. We either broke up our numbers into the wrong factors, or we messed up our signs. And again, you're always going to take the sign of this first number here. So then what we're going to do is factor out this 3x minus 2, which becomes our first parenthesis of our answer. And when we factor that out, we're left with a 2x plus 3. All right, I've got 2 more for today. Number 4, 4x squared minus 18x plus 20. 4x squared minus 18x plus 20. So do you remember what the first step in factoring was that we mentioned in the last video? Your first step in factoring is always to check for a GCF, your greatest common factor. So here, I have a greatest common factor that goes into all 3 terms. The biggest number that goes into 4x squared, 18x, and 20 is 2. So the first thing I'm going to do is factor out a 2. That leaves me with a 2x squared minus 9x plus 10. And now on this inside part, I can use factor by grouping. Okay, so I'm going to kind of ignore that 2 that was just kind of going to carry down by itself. And I'm going to focus on this inside parenthesis. So first step is to multiply our first term times our last term. So we are looking for factors of 20 that have a sum of negative 9. So my factors of 20, 1 and 20, 2 and 10, 3 does not go in there, 4 goes in there 5 times, and now we've started wrapping back around. Since it's a positive 20, they either both have to be positive or both have to be negative. But since we're adding to a negative, they should both be negative. So to make this work, I would use negative 4 and negative 5. So remember how I said we wanted to split this one into our negative one first and our positive one second? When we both have a negative, they'll both have to be a negative. So it doesn't technically matter. So we have we'll keep this 2 as a GCF on the outside. And then we split the negative 9x. So 2x squared minus 4x minus 5x plus 10. And then we'll group these and factor out our greatest common factor. So our greatest common factor between this first parenthesis of 2x squared minus 4x would be a 2x. And this would leave me with an x minus 2. Now my greatest common factor between a negative 5x and a 10 would be a negative 5. So remember, we're going to take the sign of whatever this number is. If it's negative, we're going to factor out a negative. If it's positive, we're going to factor out a positive. Which leaves me with an x minus 2, because I have to take positive 10 and divide it by my GCF of negative 2. So x minus 2 and x minus 2, these are the same. So I'm going to factor out an x minus 2. And when I do that, I'm left with a 2x minus 5. Those GCFs make up my other parenthesis. And let's not forget that 2 that we factored out originally. And this is our answer. All right. Now I'd like you guys to try this next one. 6x squared plus 15x plus 6. So I'd like you guys to go ahead and try this next one. 6x squared plus 15x plus 6. All right. So hopefully the first thing you did was factor out a GCF. Your GCF for this problem should have been 3. We should factor out a 3 from everything first. You can use a parenthesis. So we're left with 2x squared plus 5x plus 2. And then what's left on the inside, we should use grouping. So 2 times 2 means I'm looking for factors of 4 that have a sum of 5. Those two numbers should be 1 and 4. So we would split this into a plus 1x and a plus 4x. So the next thing that we want to do is group them. So I'm going to draw parentheses around the first two and parentheses around the second two. So when I factor out my greatest common factor from my first parenthesis, so between 2x squared and a 1x, the biggest number that goes into both of those is 1x, or just an x. And I'm left with a 2x plus 1. Now my greatest common factor from my second parenthesis, the 4x plus 2, would be a positive 2, which would be leaving me with a 2x plus 1. And I still have this 3 on the outside. So then I factor out my 2x plus 1s are the same. Remember, if they're not the same, you either did something wrong or the problem can't be factored. So my first parenthesis is a 2x plus 1, because I'm going to factor out a 2x plus 1. And when I take those away, I'm left with an x plus 2. And we still have this 3 as a GCF hanging out in front. So let's summarize our different factoring methods. And we're going to kind of make a little flow chart. So when we start factoring, our first step in factoring is to always check for a GCF. Check for a greatest common factor. After that, you're going to look for three different things. So depending on what the problem looks like, depends on the next method you're going to choose. So if you have two terms, three terms, or four terms. Now, if you have two terms, you are going to check to see if you have perfect squares or perfect cubes. If you have perfect squares, you are using difference of squares, or you are checking for a difference of squares. If you have perfect cubes, you're going to be using the sum or the difference of cubes formula. Now, we did not go over the sum and difference of cubes formula here. So we are not going to be using this one in our next upcoming unit, okay? We only focused on out of these two difference of squares. I'm just showing you this because in case you're watching this video later on, there is other methods of factoring other than the ones we discussed. But for the context of this video, we are not necessarily focusing on these. Now, if you had three terms, same kind of thing. You're going to check to see, does A equal 1? Does the number with my x squared term equal 1? Or does the number with my x squared term not equal 1? So if the first number is 1, we're going to use factor sum. And if A does not equal 1, we're going to use grouping. Or if you took one of my previous classes, SAM. And we focused on both of these in the past two videos, so these are both valid methods that we're looking at. Now, four terms, you would use factor by grouping. And again, it's the same method as this grouping, except there's four terms already, so you don't have to split it. And again, we did not go over this, so we're not really going to be factoring by grouping. So the only main ones we're going to be focusing on is GCF, difference of squares, factor sum, and SAM. There again are other methods of factoring. We just didn't necessarily go over them because they're not needed for the next upcoming unit. And besides 2, 3, and 4, we don't necessarily have a solid factoring method that will work for 5 terms, 6 terms, etc.